What would you do if the only thing you had left of a person you loved was a handful of papers everyone called worthless? If you inherited not a fortune, but a riddle written on brittle, sun-faded maps that had led your own father to ruin and an early grave? This was the legacy left to Eleanor Pike, a collection of cryptic assay notes and star charts that the world had dismissed as the ramblings of a broken man. But the truth waiting inside that worn leather satchel was older than the territory of Arizona itself, a secret sealed not by rock and dirt, but by a lie 70 years deep. Settle in and stay close as we journey into the heart of the Ghost Canyon and learn what happens when a dismissed inheritance becomes the key to a lost fortune. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. The first thing Eleanor knew was the sun. It was a merciless weight on her eyelids, a hot coin pressed to her forehead. The second was thirst, a raw, rasping thing that had scoured her throat into a canyon of its own. She tried to swallow and tasted only dust. Her memory was a shattered piece of slate, all sharp edges and missing pieces. There had been a road, the buckboard jolting over ruts, the patient plod of her old horse, Jasper. There had been the weight of the leather satchel on the seat beside her, a weight that felt heavier than its contents, for it held the last of her father, his work, his obsession, his final desperate hope. Then, other shapes intruded. Two riders, emerging from the heat, shimmer like malevolent spirits. Their faces were obscured by dust and shadow, but their voices were clear, one rough and commanding, the other thin and nervous. They had wanted the strong box under the seat, the few dollars she had to see her through to the claims office in redemption. They had taken it. They had taken Jasper and the wagon. Then the big one, the one with a voice like grinding stones, had grabbed the satchel. He'd ripped it open, spilling the papers onto the dusty floor of the wagon. "What's this?" he'd sneered. "Chicken scratch." He'd laughed, a harsh, ugly sound in the vast silence of the desert. He'd tossed the papers aside, scattering them like dead leaves in the wind. She had lunged for them, a foolish, desperate act, and the man's arm had come up. After that, there was only a flash of blinding light, then the hard, unforgiving ground, and the silence closing in. Now she was alone. The sun was sliding toward the jagged teeth of the western mountains, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The road was empty. The papers were gone. All of it gone. She pushed herself up on trembling arms, her head screaming with a dull, throbbing pain. A dry wash snaked nearby, its sandy bed a pale scar on the landscape. Shelter, maybe. Water, no. Still, it was a place to go. She stumbled toward it, each step an agony, her vision swimming in and out of focus. The world was narrowing to a single point of survival. Just one more step, then another. She didn't see the man until his shadow fell over her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a silhouette against the dying sun. He moved with a quiet economy that spoke of long years spent in wide, empty places. For a moment, her heart seized with terror. They had come back. But this man was alone, and his posture held no threat. He knelt, and the scent of leather and horse and clean sweat reached her. He held out a canteen. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm, like water over smooth stones. Eleanor reached for it, her hand shaking, and drank. The water was the most profound mercy she had ever known. It was life itself. The man watched her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, and his eyes, a startlingly clear gray, held a deep and abiding weariness. He had seen his share of sorrows. She knew it the way an animal knows the scent of rain on the air. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact. She could only nod, the effort costing her more than she had to give. As darkness finally consumed the last of the light, she felt a strange and absolute certainty. She had lost everything. Her father's legacy was scattered to the wind, and yet she had survived. The why of it was a question for another day. For now, it was enough. The man's name was James Mercer. He took her to his cabin, a small, solid structure of peeled logs chinked with mud, nestled in a fold of the hills where it was all but invisible until you were upon it. It was a place built for solitude, a fortress against the world. Inside it was sparse and clean, a stone hearth, a narrow cot, a table with a single chair. Everything had its place. He moved about the small space with the same quiet efficiency she had seen on the trail, lighting a kerosene lamp that cast a warm, golden glow on the rough-hewn walls. He tended to the gash on her head with a gentle, practiced hand, his touch surprisingly light for a man of his size. He didn't ask many questions, and for that, she was grateful. He seemed to understand that her story was a heavy thing, not to be spilled carelessly. He learned her name, Eleanor Pike, and that she had been on her way to redemption. He gave her a bowl of thin stew that tasted of salt and wild onions, and she ate it slowly, feeling strength seep back into her bones. His horse, a powerful buckskin named Buck, watched them from the open doorway, its liquid brown eyes missing nothing. The animal was as quiet and watchful as its master. "The men who did this," James said, his voice still low. "They'll be in redemption, bragging, spending your money." Eleanor looked down at her hands. They were scraped raw from her fall. "They took everything," she whispered. "My wagon, my horse, my father's papers." James nodded, his gaze resting on the fire. "A claim?" he asked. "Most claims out here are just heartache written on a government form." She shook her head. It was more than that. He was a geologist, an astronomer too in his own way. He spent 20 years on those papers, survey lines, celestial charts, mineral assays. He believed they led to the lost shipment from the old Cobre Canyon stage. James's expression didn't change, but a stillness came over him. The Cobre Canyon robbery was a ghost story, a piece of local lore told around campfires. 70 years ago, a stagecoach carrying a fortune in gold coin from the old Spanish mines had vanished without a trace. Dozens had searched. Men had died chasing rumors and false maps. "A lot of men have looked for that gold," he said quietly. "Your father wasn't the first." He said they all looked in the wrong way, Eleanor insisted, a flicker of her father's fire alive in her voice. He said the outlaws didn't bury a treasure. They built a vault, a lock made of sunlight and stone. James was silent for a long moment, studying her face in the lamplight. He saw not a madwoman, but a daughter clinging to the last vestiges of her father's name. In redemption, miles away, Cain, the man with the voice of grinding stones, slammed a silver dollar down on the bar of the dusty saloon. His partner, a younger, reed-thin man named Abel, laughed nervously. "She was tougher than she looked," Abel said. Cain took a long drink of whiskey. "She was a fool, just like her old man. All that work for a bag of rocks and some crazy maps." He laughed again, the sound drawing glances from the other patrons. "We did her a favor. Nothing in that canyon but snakes and ghosts." He tossed the empty satchel into a corner, where it lay like a discarded snakeskin. He and Abel had what they wanted: the money, the horse, the supplies. The papers were forgotten, dismissed as the worthless ramblings they so clearly were. Back at the cabin, Eleanor felt a small, hard lump inside her clenched fist. She had been holding it so tightly her knuckles were white. She uncurled her fingers. There, resting in her palm, was a single, crumpled piece of her father's work, a fragment she must have grabbed in that last, desperate moment. It was covered in his familiar, spidery script, showing a series of angles, a constellation, and a single, cryptic phrase, where the shadow falls shortest. It was almost nothing, and yet, it was all she had left. What was written on that single, crumpled page? Could a map made of starlight and shadows truly lead to a 70-year-old fortune? Or was James Mercer right to be wary of a dead man's obsession? Let us know in the comments what you think Eleanor should do next. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories from the forgotten corners of history. Now, let's get back to the story and the town of Redemption. A few days later, when the purple bruise on her temple had faded to a sickly yellow and the strength had returned to her legs, James Mercer took her into town. Redemption wasn't much more than a single dusty street lined with weathered, false-fronted buildings, all of it shimmering under the relentless Arizona sun. It was a town that felt temporary, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better. As they walked toward the sheriff's office, Eleanor felt the weight of eyes upon her. News traveled fast in a place this small. She was the woman from the desert, the one who'd been robbed and left for dead. She was a curiosity, a piece of someone else's drama. James walked beside her, a solid, reassuring presence. His silence was a shield, his stoic demeanor a clear message to leave them be. The sheriff, a man named Brody with a kind face and tired eyes, listened patiently to her story. He took notes, asked a few gentle questions, but offered little hope. Men like that, he said with a sigh. They drift like tumbleweeds. They're probably halfway to the border by now. Eleanor's heart sank. She knew he was right. There was no justice to be found here. As they left the office, the bat-wing doors of the saloon swung open, spilling harsh laughter and the sour smell of stale beer onto the street. Two men stepped out, blinking in the bright sun. Eleanor froze. It was them. The big one, Kane, saw her, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He nudged his partner, Abel. "Well, look what the buzzards didn't finish," Kane drawled, his voice loud enough for half the street to hear. He swaggered toward them, his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Heard you were looking for us." James stepped slightly in front of Eleanor, a subtle, protective movement. "Keep walking, Kane," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Kane ignored him, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. "Still chasing your daddy's ghosts? I told you, there's nothing in that canyon. Old Man Pike died for a pile of worthless rocks and a head full of sun-addled dreams. You'd be smart to learn from his mistake." The townspeople who had been watching now looked away, embarrassed or unwilling to get involved. The mockery was public, a humiliation laid bare in the middle of the street. Eleanor stood her ground, her chin held high, her silence her only retort. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear or her anger. Finally, Kane spat in the dust near her feet and turned away, heading back into the saloon with Abel trailing in his wake. "Let's go," James murmured, his hand briefly touching her elbow. As they turned to leave the oppressive heat of the main street, a stooped figure shuffled out from an alleyway. He was an old prospector, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his clothes little more than rags held together by dirt and determination. The townsfolk called him Hemlock. He stopped in front of Eleanor, his pale, watery eyes fixing on the small, folded paper she still clutched in her hand. He reached out a gnarled finger and tapped it once. His voice was like the rustle of dry leaves in a forgotten place. "Some maps don't show you where to walk," he rasped, his words heavy with a strange authority. "They show you when to look." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply nodded once, a slow, deliberate gesture, and shuffled away, disappearing back into the shadows from which he'd come. Eleanor stared after him, the old man's words echoing in her mind. They were nonsense. And yet, they felt like the first piece of truth she had heard all day. The cryptic phrase hung in the air between them all the way back to James's cabin. When to look. It made no sense. A map was a map, a chart of a physical place. It told you where to walk, where to dig. Eleanor spread the crumpled fragment on the rough-hewn table, the lamplight tracing the faint lines and symbols her father had so painstakingly drawn. James stood over her shoulder, his arms crossed, his expression skeptical. "It's a fool's errand, Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Kane is a liar and a thief, but he's not wrong about that canyon. It's been picked clean by prospectors for 50 years. If there was anything to find, it would have been found." "They were all looking for a landmark," she countered, her finger tracing a curve on the paper that represented not a hill, but the arc of a constellation, Lyra. A blaze on a tree, a cross carved in stone. My father believed the map wasn't on the ground. It was in the sky. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "He wasn't a fool, James. He was meticulous. Everything he did had a reason. I can't let his life's work end as a joke in a saloon." She saw a flicker of something in his gray eyes. Not belief, but a deep, resonant understanding of duty. He, too, was a man who lived by a code. He had lost someone. She was sure of it now. A wife, perhaps. He knew what it was to honor the dead. He sighed, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "One day," he said, "I'll take you out there. We'll give it one day. Then we come back." The journey to the Ghost Canyon took them half a day, riding single file through a landscape of stark and brutal beauty. The sun beat down, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and hot stone and the faint, spicy smell of creosote. James rode ahead on Buck, his back straight, his gaze sweeping the horizon with a practiced eye. He knew this land, its moods, its dangers. Eleanor followed, the silence of the desert pressing in on her, a vast and indifferent presence. By late afternoon, they arrived. The canyon was a deep gash in the earth, its walls streaked with red and ochre. The location marked on her father's fragment led them not to the canyon floor, but to a high, wide ledge overlooking it. And there, set into the sheer rock face, was a cave. It was a disappointment. The opening was shallow, little more than a wide scoop in the sandstone, barely deep enough to offer shelter from the wind. The floor was littered with the detritus of decades of failed hopes. Rusted tins, the charred remains of old campfires, a broken pickaxe head. It looked exactly as Kane had described it, a place of snakes and ghosts long since abandoned. A cold knot of doubt tightened in Eleanor's stomach. Had her father been wrong? Had she dragged this quiet, decent man out here on a mad chase, fueled by nothing more than grief and pride? James dismounted and walked the perimeter of the cave, his boots crunching on the loose scree. He ran a hand over the rock, his expression giving nothing away. "Nothing here," he said finally, his voice flat. "It's just a wind hollow." They made camp as the sun began to dip below the canyon rim, a fire crackling between them, a small point of warmth and light in the vast, encroaching darkness. The desert night came on fast, the sky turning a deep, star-dusted indigo. Eleanor felt a profound sense of failure. She had reached the end of her father's map, and it had led to nothing. As she sat staring into the flames, a strange restlessness seemed to settle over the camp. Buck, who had been dozing peacefully, was suddenly alert. His ears pricked, his gaze fixed on the dark maw of the cave. He let out a low, uneasy snort, shifting his weight from hoof to hoof. The air grew colder, the way it does just before a storm, though the sky was perfectly clear. A low moan of wind whispered out of the cave entrance, a sound like a long, sad exhalation. Eleanor shivered, though not from the cold. It felt as if the canyon itself was watching them, holding its breath. The next morning broke clear and sharp. The first rays of sun crested the eastern rim of the canyon, spearing down into the valley below. Eleanor had slept poorly, troubled by dreams of whispers in the dark and the weight of her own dashed hopes. She rose and walked to the edge of the ledge, the single piece of paper clutched in her hand, now feeling flimsy and foolish. As the sun climbed higher, a beam of pure golden light struck the rock face high above the cave entrance, and in that precise moment, Eleanor saw it. It was a carving, so faint and weathered as to be nearly invisible, rendered in a style that was not native, nor from any prospector she had ever seen. It was a geometric pattern, a spiral intersected by a series of straight lines. Her breath caught in her throat. She smoothed the crumpled paper against her knee. There, in the upper corner, was the exact same symbol. It wasn't a landmark in the traditional sense. It was an astronomical marker, a sign meant to be seen only at a specific time of day, at a specific time of year, when to look. Hemlock's words rushed back to her with the force of a revelation. Her father hadn't been mapping a trail. He had been mapping light itself. She turned to James, her eyes wide with a new, electrifying certainty. "Look," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she pointed. James followed her gaze. He squinted, his scout's eyes accustomed to picking out the smallest details in a vast landscape. He saw the symbol, and a flicker of interest crossed his stoic features. But he was looking at something else. He walked back toward the shallow cave, his eyes not on the walls, but on the ground. "The erosion," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He knelt and ran his calloused hand over the pattern of gullies and washes cut into the rock by millennia of rainfall. "It's wrong." Eleanor came to stand beside him. "What do you mean?" "Water flows downhill," he said, stating the obvious. "The runoff from this ledge should all drain that way." He pointed to the steep drop-off. "But here," he traced a line in the dirt with his finger, "some of it has been diverted. Over centuries, it flows back toward the rear of the cave, as if it's draining into the rock." He stood and walked to the back of the shallow alcove, running his hands over the sandstone wall. It felt solid, immovable, but the evidence was there at his feet. The water went somewhere. The two clues hung in the air between them, separate but connected. A symbol that could only be seen at sunrise, and a geological anomaly that defied logic. The cave was not what it appeared to be. It was a facade, a clever piece of natural camouflage hiding something else entirely. The disappointment of the previous night evaporated, replaced by a thrumming, intense curiosity. Her father had been here. He had seen these same things. He hadn't been mad. He had been a patient, brilliant observer, reading a language that no one else had even known existed. The map was not the paper in her hand. The map was the canyon itself, and they had just learned the first letter of its alphabet. The real work was about to begin. The silent, watchful presence of the canyon no longer felt menacing. It felt like an invitation. They decided to stay. James rode back to his cabin for more supplies, ropes, lanterns, digging tools, leaving Eleanor to keep watch. Alone on the ledge, she felt not fear, but a profound connection to her father. She could almost feel him there beside her, his quiet excitement, the thrill of the puzzle about to be solved. She spent the day studying the fragment, cross-referencing the star charts with the position of the sun, trying to understand the intricate celestial clockwork he had uncovered. When James returned, they began to work in earnest. Their partnership fell into a natural rhythm, his physical strength and practical knowledge of the land complementing her understanding of her father's esoteric notes. He was the hands. She was the mind. They started at the back of the cave, where the unnatural erosion patterns were most pronounced. James tapped the rock face with the head of a hammer, listening to the sound. Thud, 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 the dull sound of solid stone. Then, in one spot, a subtle change, a hollow, resonant echo. Thump. There. Something's behind this, he said, his voice low with controlled excitement. For 2 days they labored. Under the relentless sun, they used picks and crowbars, clearing away the loose scree and debris that had accumulated at the base of the wall over 70 years. It was grueling, back-breaking work. Dust filled their lungs and sweat stung their eyes. James worked with a tireless, steady pace, his movements economical and powerful. Eleanor worked alongside him, hauling away buckets of rock, her muscles screaming in protest. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, exhausted, sharing a silent companionship forged in shared labor. He spoke little of his past, but she learned in fragments that he had been a scout for the army, and that his wife had died of a fever 5 years prior. He had retreated to his cabin to escape a world that had become too loud with loss. Buck, the buckskin, was their silent companion through it all, his quiet presence a steadying force. He would watch them work, his ears occasionally flicking toward the canyon trail as if listening for intruders, a silent, four-legged guardian. On the 3rd day, their tools uncovered a series of smaller markings carved into the rock face near the floor, previously hidden by dirt. They weren't symbols like the one outside. They were constellations, precisely rendered. Cygnus, Aquila, Draco, and next to each one, a number. Eleanor recognized it immediately. It was her father's code. The numbers corresponded to dates and times, a celestial timetable. "This isn't just a vault," she breathed, wiping sweat from her brow. "It's a calendar, a lock that only opens on a certain day." They worked through the notes on her paper fragment, her father's spidery script a lifeline to his thinking. The final piece of the puzzle was the phrase, "where the shadow falls shortest." "The solstice," James said, looking up at the sun. "The summer solstice, the longest day of the year when the sun is at its highest point in the sky and the shadows are at their shortest." Eleanor checked her father's calculations. He had been there on that very day, the year before he died. He had solved it. He had found the final key. A wave of both triumph and sorrow washed over her. He had been so close. According to the almanac James kept, the summer solstice was just 2 days away. All their labor, all her father's years of research, were about to be put to the test. The canyon held its breath, waiting. They waited. The 2 days felt longer than all the preceding ones combined. An air of tense anticipation settled over their small camp. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts. For Eleanor, it was a vigil for her father. She was about to walk the last few feet of a journey he had spent a lifetime making. For James, it was something else. A cautious re-engagement with a world of risk and hope he had long since abandoned. He found himself invested in her quest, in her quiet, unshakable faith. He wanted her to be right. The morning of the solstice dawned achingly beautiful, the sky a flawless pale blue. They were in position long before noon, standing inside the shallow cave, watching the sun climb toward its zenith. As the hour approached, the light outside grew harsh and white, and the shadows in the canyon shrank to almost nothing. Eleanor held her father's paper, her knuckles white. James stood beside her, his hand resting on the handle of the sledgehammer they had brought. The minutes ticked by, marked only by the slow crawl of light across the stone. Then it happened. High above them, a fissure in the canyon wall, no wider than a man's hand and invisible from below, caught the sun at its highest point. A single, perfect shaft of light, as straight and sharp as a thrown spear, pierced the gloom of the cave. It struck the back wall, not randomly, but on a single, specific flagstone. The stone was no different from any other, but in that moment, illuminated by the solstice sun, it seemed to burn with a light of its own. It was the target, the bullseye, the final piece of the lock. "There," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with awe. James needed no further instruction. He stepped forward, hefted the sledgehammer, and swung. The hammer struck the illuminated stone with a deafening crack. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan of grinding rock, the stone shifted inward. Dust and the smell of stale, ancient air billowed out. Behind the stone was not a treasure chamber, but a dark, narrow opening, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was a man-made passage. James lit a lantern, its yellow flame pushing back against a darkness that was 70 years deep. He went first, Eleanor close behind him. The passage was short, no more than 10 feet long, and it opened into a small, dry chamber carved directly out of the living rock. And there, stacked against the far wall, were the decaying remains of leather saddlebags and 3 small, iron-banded wooden chests. The air was utterly still, a perfect, breathless silence. With the claw of the hammer, James pried the lid off the nearest chest. The wood splintered and gave way. Eleanor held the lantern closer, her heart pounding against her ribs. The chest was filled to the brim, not with rocks or dirt, but with the soft, heavy gleam of gold coins, tarnished with age but unmistakable. Spanish doubloons, American eagles, coins minted long before Arizona was even a territory. It was all there. Her father had been right. He had been right about everything. He was not a fool who died chasing shadows. He was a brilliant, patient man who had read a secret written in the sky. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, tears of vindication, of grief, of a profound and quiet triumph. She reached in and let a handful of the heavy coins run through her fingers. They were cold, real, and they were the proof, the final word in her father's story. As they stood in the silent golden glow of the hidden chamber, a low rumble echoed from the canyon outside. It was not thunder. It was the sound of shifting rock. Before they could react, the sky, which had been clear moments before, was blotted out. A desert monsoon had rolled in with shocking speed, a roiling wall of black clouds that unleashed a torrent of rain. The dry wash on the canyon floor would become a raging river in minutes. They were trapped. But the storm was not their only problem. Through the sheet of rain, Eleanor saw them, two figures on the opposite rim of the canyon, making their way precariously down the trail. Cain and Abel. Word of their expedition must have reached the saloon. Cain's dismissal of her father's quest had been a bluff, his greed finally overriding his skepticism. He had followed them. "Get back inside," James ordered, his voice tight. He drew the pistol from his belt, its metallic click loud in the sudden gloom. They retreated into the main cave, using the entrance to the hidden passage for cover. The rain came down in a blinding curtain, turning the ledge into a slick, treacherous surface. Cain and Abel reached the far side of the ledge, soaked and furious. "Pike!" Cain bellowed, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "I know you're in there. Don't make this harder than it has to be." A gunshot answered him, not from James, but from Cain himself. The bullet ricocheted off the rock near the cave entrance with a vicious whine. James fired back, a single, carefully aimed shot designed to warn, not to kill. The standoff was set. They were pinned down, with a fortune at their backs and two desperate men in front of them, the fury of the storm raging all around. The deluge was loosening the very rock of the canyon. Another gunshot from Cain, wild this time, struck the cliff face high above them. A sickening crack echoed through the canyon, and a section of the overhang, weakened by the water and the impact, gave way. A cascade of rock and mud thundered down onto the ledge, right where Abel was standing. He cried out, a sharp yelp of pain, as he was knocked from his feet, his leg pinned beneath a heavy slab of rock. Cain, seeing his partner trapped and the situation growing more dangerous by the second, didn't hesitate. He turned and began scrambling back the way he came, abandoning Abel to his fate. The rising water on the canyon floor was already beginning to lick at the edges of the main ledge. In another 10 minutes, the entire shelf would be underwater. Abel stared, his face a mask of betrayal and terror, as he struggled against the rock that held him fast. He was going to drown. Eleanor looked at James. His face was a hard mask, his pistol still trained on the trail where Cain had vanished. He had every reason to leave Abel to his fate. The man had been party to robbing her, to leaving her for dead. But as she looked at the young man's terrified face, she saw not a monster, but a foolish boy who had made a terrible mistake. "We have to help him," she said, her voice clear and steady above the storm. James looked from her to the trapped man, then back again. His jaw was tight. This was the test: vengeance or mercy. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod. He laid down his pistol, grabbed a length of rope, and under Eleanor's direction, they moved out into the storm. It was their choice. In the heart of the crisis, surrounded by enemies and the violence of nature, they chose to save a life rather than protect a treasure. The rescue was a brutal, desperate affair. James, with the rope tied securely around his waist and Eleanor anchoring the other end, fought his way across the slick, debris-strewn ledge. The wind and rain tore at them, and the rising water swirled around their ankles, cold and heavy with silt. Abel was pale with shock, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. He watched them approach with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Why?" he stammered, as James knelt beside him, assessing the situation. "He left you." "We're not him," James grunted, positioning the crowbar he'd carried with him as a lever under the heavy rock. "On 3, he yelled to Eleanor over the storm's roar. "Pull!" On his command, she dug her heels in and leaned back, the rope biting into her hands, while James threw his entire weight against the crowbar. The rock shifted just an inch, but it was enough. Abel screamed as a fresh wave of pain shot through him, but he managed to drag his mangled leg free. James half dragged, half carried the injured man back to the relative safety of the cave, just as a fresh wave of floodwater surged over the ledge, sweeping away the last of their campfire and supplies. They pulled Abel into the dry chamber with the gold, the irony lost on no one. The man who had come to steal the fortune was now being sheltered by it. The storm raged for another hour. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, it passed. The clouds broke, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered back into the canyon, illuminating a world that had been washed clean and violently rearranged. As the floodwaters receded, they made their preparations to leave. Abel, humbled and in agony, told them everything. He confessed to the robbery on the road, to Cain's obsessive greed, and how Cain had planned to kill them both and take the gold for himself. His gratitude was a raw, painful thing to witness. They fashioned a crude splint for his leg, and using one of the old leather saddlebags to carry a portion of the gold as proof, they began the slow journey back to redemption. Buck, the ever-steady horse, carried the injured Abel, while James and Eleanor walked alongside. They arrived in town not as specters from the desert, but as a strange, battered procession. The sight of them, James Mercer, the town recluse, Eleanor Pike, the madman's daughter, and Abel, a known associate of Cain's, clearly injured and subdued, brought the entire populace out onto the street. They went directly to Sheriff Brody's office. He was the kind professional, the anchor of order in this chaotic land. He listened, his tired eyes taking in every detail. The mud-caked clothes, the exhausted lines on their faces, the heavy weight of the leather bag James placed on his desk. Brody unfastened the buckle and poured a small pile of the tarnished gold coins onto the blotter. He picked one up, rubbing the dirt from its face. His eyebrows shot up. 1821. He murmured, a note of pure astonishment in his voice. The Cobra Canyon shipment. He then took Abel's formal statement, the young man's confession coming in a rush of shame and relief. An hour later, Sheriff Brody had his posse. They rode out and found Cain trying to get a fresh horse at a remote ranch, his pockets full of Eleanor's stolen dollars. He surrendered without a fight, his arrogance shattered. The vindication was absolute. The townspeople who had whispered and mocked now stared at Eleanor with a new kind of reverence. She was not the daughter of a fool. She was the woman who had listened to a ghost and solved a 70-year-old crime. She had walked into the heart of a legend and emerged with the truth. Her father's name was not just cleared, it was etched into the town's history forever. Weeks passed. The legalities were handled with a surprising swiftness, expedited by the federal marshals who had long considered the Cobra Canyon gold a closed case. After a significant portion was claimed by the government as the successor to the original transport company, the rest was awarded to Eleanor Pike as the sole heir of the man who had discovered it. She was, by the standards of redemption, a wealthy woman. But the money felt secondary to something far more profound. She had reclaimed her father's legacy, transforming it from a story of failure into one of quiet, intellectual triumph. The mocking whispers in town had been replaced by respectful nods. Children would sometimes stop and stare at her, as if she were a figure from one of the tall tales told around their own firesides. She had bought a small, sturdy house at the edge of town, one with a porch that looked out toward the distant purple mountains. But she spent most of her days at James Mercer's cabin, helping him repair a fence or tend to his small garden. A quiet, unspoken understanding had grown between them, forged in labor and crisis. The walls he had built around himself had begun to come down, brick by slow brick. The deep weariness in his eyes was being replaced by a calm watchfulness, a quiet contentment. One evening, they stood together on the porch of his cabin, watching the sunset. The desert sky was ablaze with color, a final, glorious flourish before the coming of the stars. The air was cool and smelled of dust and pine. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Buck stood nearby, his head lowered, dozing in the twilight. The silence was comfortable, complete. It needed no words to fill it. Finally, Eleanor broke it, her voice soft in the gloaming. "My father wasn't looking for gold," she said, the thought having settled in her mind over the past weeks, becoming a solid and certain truth. She looked over at James, whose gaze was fixed on the horizon. He was looking for something true. James turned his head, his clear gray eyes meeting hers. He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth softened. He gave a single, slow nod. He understood. He too had been searching for something true in the vast, lonely silence of his own life. The treasure wasn't the gold in the vault. It was the proof that a person's faith in an idea, in a pattern, in a truth that only they could see, was worth more than all the world's derision. It was the vindication of a life spent listening to the subtle language of the earth and the sky. In that shared, quiet moment, a new story began, not of a lost fortune, but of a found future. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this journey. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are found by honoring the wisdom that the world has chosen to dismiss. If you were moved by Eleanor's story of faith and vindication, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our channel for more tales of the unsung heroes of the past. Let us know in the comments what part of her discovery resonated with you the most. We'll be back soon with another story of a forgotten legacy brought back into the light. Until then, take care.